I'm J.G. Michael, and this is Parallax Views. This edition of Parallax Views is brought to you by the $10 and above tier supporters of Parallax Views on Patreon. So, with that in mind, producers credit shoutouts to Galen, Matt, Gunnar, Mark, Simon, Alexander, Catherine, G, Tilo, Emilia, Jeremy, Jeff, John, Bert, Brian, Elliot, Michael, Brace, James, Nick, Mersham, Galen, Gareth, Arlen, Bo, Christopher, Michael, Gigadelic Media, Chance, Chase, Dan, Big Bob, David H, Y. Kellerman, Sadeed 13, Kathleen, David, Ava, Bob, The West Bank Robbery Podcast, Jamie, Enoch, Gary, Max, Ishtofer, James, Martin, Matthew Ho, Brian, Nobody, Thomas, and Dano. And now on to the show. Hey there, Parallax Views listeners. As always, I want to remind you that if you support the work here I do at Parallax Views, please consider supporting me on Patreon at patreon.com/parallaxviews. One more time, that's patreon.com/parallaxviews. With that out of the way, we have a very timely episode. It's been a historic week. In the last episode, we were talking about the toppling of the French government due to a no-confidence vote at the National Assembly on Wednesday. In this episode, we'll talk about another toppling, this time the toppling of Assad in Syria by rebel forces. What comes next is anyone's guess, but we'll be looking at all the different scenarios that could play out, who benefits, what this means for Iran, what this means for Russia, what this means for Israel, what this means for Turkey, and of course, what this may mean for Syria. We'll delve into these Syrian rebel groups that overthrew Assad. We'll look at all the players, and joining us to do that is returning guest James Dorsey, a journalist and independent scholar who is a go-to source on this program for his insights and expertise related to the Middle East. With that being said, let's get right to it with James Dorsey. Welcome back to Parallax Views, a guest that I'm so happy to have on. He's become a bit of a regular. He's a journalist and independent scholar, James M. Dorsey. He's sort of my go-to voice when it comes to the latest developments in the Middle East. And we're going to be talking about Syria. And it's a topic that I haven't always covered because I just feel like it's almost like a House of Mirrors world unless you're an expert on the topic. And I just feel like there's a lot of landmines when talking about Syria. But now I feel like it's more important than ever to cover it, given that we just saw the president, Assad, toppled by Syrian rebels. And that's the headline at Reuters today. Just updated 22 minutes ago at Reuters, Syrian rebels topple President Assad. So I guess to start out, James, what is your opinion on this development?
Well, simple thing to say is it's fascinating. I think it's enormously important. This is a paradigm shift, and it rewrites the political map, the geopolitical map of the Middle East. What it does with regard to Iran, it punctures, if not destroys for all practical purposes, Iran's forward defense strategy, which is one pillar of its overall defense strategy, which means it's left with two other pillars, that's ballistic missiles and nuclear. But taking out Syria, plus the Lebanese ceasefire, the weakening of Hezbollah overall, the move of armed Hezbollah units away from the Israeli border, means that the Iranian defense strategy, which was built on having these allies bordering on Israel as a deterrence, no longer exists. And what that's going to mean is that Iran's going to have to rethink its policies, and not just its defense policies, but its policies more in general. And we'll have to see where that comes out. It's also a paradigm shift for Russia. Now, it's not clear, as a matter of principle, I think one would expect that the new government in Damascus, whatever that government looks like, would ask the Russians to leave. Keep in mind that the Russians have a naval facility, military naval facility in Tartus, and they have an air base just outside of Latakia, which is the stronghold of the Alawites, the Shiite Muslim sect to which Assad and his family belong. In principle, one would assume the government's going to ask the Russians to leave. There's been no real statement on that, so we don't know that for a fact. And it's not inconceivable that the uh, the new government, partly in a bid to regain the trust of the Alawites, would cut some deal with the Russians, which would allow them to remain there. So, but this is all speculation. If the Russians are forced to withdraw their troops from Syria, they lose their foremost military presence in the Middle East and in the Eastern Mediterranean. So this is really crucial.
In terms of what happens next, I assume your answer is going to be the honest one that I'm not hearing enough these days, which is I don't know. I
It's
mean,
basically
I
that's
think you're
correct.
because you're a bit more honest, I think, than a lot of people. I think a lot of people want to make pronouncements. You haven't really done that though with this.
No, and I don't intend to. I think at this point it's a question of drawing scenarios. Um, on the positive side of this, um, there is the possibility that this becomes a government that is inclusive, that will focus on reconstruction of a war-ravaged economy and on healing wounds of war. Um, that's certainly been the approach that they've shown in the last few days. We've not seen really any reports. There's been some disturbing video, but we've not really seen any reports of widespread violence against minorities, widespread violence, acts of revenge against representatives of the former regime, uh, widespread acts of looting or tearing down of government facilities. That, on the contrary, we've seen calls for no revenge, calls for keeping state institutions intact, talking about cooperating with the prime minister, or the man who was prime minister and his prime minister under the Bassam al-Assad um, regime. And of course, we've seen what many question, but nonetheless, I think one's got to take account of a fairly consistent move away from not from religious ultra-conservatism, but from concepts of jihad over the last 8 or 9 years, particularly as they built their stronghold, the rebel stronghold of Hay'at Tahrir al-Sham in Idlib, and factually turned what was the poorest region of Syria into its fastest growing region. So that's the positive side. And that could, it's not theoretically could happen. There are lots of pitfalls. There's going to have to be the balance of power within the rebels, between various rebel groups. There's going to have to be, if indeed parts of the former regime are going to be incorporated, at least in a transitionary period, that balance of power is going to have to be sorted out. Um, we don't know what a transition means. Hay'at Tahrir al-Sham is not a force for democracy. It yes, it is to a degree an economic success story in Idlib, but it ran a very authoritarian regime in which dissidents were take this spring where you had protest demonstrations where people were not shouting down with Assad, they were shouting down with Jolani, the Hayat Tahrir al-Sham leader.
This
Now, to
is
be
the group
fair,
that's
it was
often called HTS, right? In the press and
that's
whatnot.
correct.
Okay.
That's correct, and it's basically the foremost rebel group, if you wish. Um, you're going to have issues with Turkey, presumably, over the Kurds. This is a government that is going to want to restore sovereignty over all of Syrian territory, which would include the Turkish buffer zone. So it's also a government which is taking over an economy that's destroyed. It's going to have to win confidence of many of those, particularly in the Gulf and the West for that matter, and others who are going to be uh, critical or skeptical of the ex-jihadist element in that government, which could be a very strong element and could impair that government's access to reconstruction funds. So there are, potentially huge pitfalls, and I think trying to predict this at this moment um, is really just putting a finger up in the air and seeing which way the wind blows.
If you could, with regards to HTS and Abu Mohammed al-Golani, al-Jilani, I see a lot of people that will argue that they're still jihadists. And I don't know what to make either way of a lot of these things. So what are your thoughts on the analysis that some people are making or speculation that some people are making that no, they haven't really changed in any way? Um, do you think they could be right, or do you think they're off point?
Look, first of all, I think that there are people who have there's room for a genuine concern. Um, you
That's what I
know,
was trying to ask as well, because I know a lot of people also write off that concern. Yeah.
no, there's room for genuine concern. Um, we've seen what the way they've conducted themselves in Idlib. Idlib is that they had 3 million people there. This is a different ballgame, and so this is also going to put their administrative skills or lack thereof to the test. But fair enough. I mean, I accept that you can have genuine concerns and want to wait and see what happens. But I think you're also going to see a lot of politically motivated or ideologically motivated saying, no, no, these are jihadists, um, because it serves a political purpose. Now, first of all, what Giuliani said in the CNN interview, in which he sort of, I'm paraphrasing, but it came down to, I was in my 30s and people change. It's
This
true.
is where he's
You and
renouncing
I,
any ties to Al Qaeda and yeah.
right. Yeah, I mean, it's true. You and I have changed and probably had different views 10 years ago. So, I think that's a fair answer. But the other thing is, the assumption that once a jihadist, always a jihadist is a very static view, and human beings are not static. Uh, but let me make one other point. Um, Giuliani's move towards emphasizing the delivery of public goods and services rather than going on ideological rampages and being somewhat more pragmatic is not unique. It's in many ways what Al Qaeda has been doing and saying for several years already. So, with other words, there is a uh, there is uh, a trend within these jihadist groups that goes in that direction. Now, the last thing I'll say is certainly in the global south, and in this case, I'll include Israel in that, you have leaders who come to power or won independence for their countries by perpetrating violence and being denounced as terrorists. And if you wanted to take that approach, that's as fair in Syria as it was in Israel or in multiple African countries.
Where is you mentioned there may be legitimate concerns. What are the legitimate concerns people could have about HTS?
Well, look, first of all, I think one is expectations. This is not a democratic movement. It may be a movement that looks more at consensus today, but their political vision is not a democratic vision, and you just have to look at Idlib to see that. Expressions of critical expressions were answered very firmly. So I think that's one issue. Uh, there is the concern. I mean, what it's not unreasonable to assume that there are within the Hay'at Tahrir sort of world, if you wish, hardliners who may push for a more jihadist approach. Um, you know, there's the concern there's an Israeli concern. What now? I think the concern is twofold. Are they going to see is a Hayat Tahrir al-Sham government going to see Israel as the major enemy about which it needs to do something? And what happens if the Assad regime left behind stores of chemical weapons, for example, and that those fall into the hands or taken over by Hamas Hayat Tahrir government? So there are all kinds of legitimate concerns here.
In terms of the future, I mean, so HST is sort of a paramilitary group. Do you think, I mean, there's a big difference between um, governance and rebelling against a form of government. In this case, there's a difference between toppling Assad and then replacing Assad with a new form of governance. Do you think that's going to be the big problem going forward? Because it sounds like these rebel factions are going to have to be dealing with, well, rather deep ethnic and sectarian divisions.
Sure. I mean, look, first of all, Syria is a country with uh, with a mosaic of ethnic and religious groupings, all of them minorities. It still is a majority Sunni Muslim country, but nevertheless, and there's a lot of confidence building that's going to have to happen. And to be fair, uh, Hayat Tahrir has started some of that, certainly with the Christians in Aleppo, for example. And again, the fact that you haven't seen major acts of revenge. Uh, so I think those are positive signs. Um, there's, they have some administrative experience in Idlib, which is in northern Syria, which is basically what's the rebel-held territory that the Bashar al-Assad government had not regained control of. But as I mentioned earlier, governing a country like Syria is a different ballgame, and we're going to have to see. It also the last point on this is uh, there's the question of Hay'at Tahrir's future as an organization. There have been suggestions that Hayat Tahrir would, as a military organization, would dissolve itself and become a political organization. There was a lot of attention paid to the fact, I think it was 2 days ago, where Abu Mohammed al-Golani, for the first time, certainly for the first time since the Civil War began, identified himself his real name, Ahmed al-Shara, rather than by his nom de guerre, Abu Muhammad al-Julani, which was interpreted as a sign of a transition from a military to a political phase.
In terms of how we got here, I mentioned earlier, and I think you smiled a bit when I said it because you knew what I was talking about. I said that it's hard for me to cover Syria because I feel like I'm entering this House of Mirrors, just information war. There's all different factions of people, not just within Syria, but from without of Syria, from outside of it, that have their own agenda and ideological motivations for certain talking points when it comes to Syria. And that includes both pro-Assad elements and I would say anti-Assad elements. So I think this has led to a lot of just confusion or misunderstandings about Syria, especially since the Civil War. What are the biggest
Like,
misunderstandings you think people have about Syria?
well, let me turn this around. Like everything in the Middle East, it's complex.
Right, right.
So, look, you have a relatively larger than usual number of external players. You have Turkey, you have Russia, you have Iran, you have Israel, you have non-state actors like Hezbollah. You have the Gulf states, which at times are going, their own individual way in Syria. The Qataris, the Emiratis, the Saudis. Uh,
Or the United
that's a lot
States
of
even.
external, and the United States. How could I forget? Uh, you know, uh, that's a large number of external players. Now, the way they played is in different ways. It's not that each one of them had a different group, and therefore you got. But on top of that, you indeed have multiple groups within the rebel force, multiple groups within the broader Syrian opposition community, and it gets tough to keep track of all of this without question. Um, I think at this point there's very little I would agree on with um, with Donald Trump, if anything. But I would agree with him when I think today said in a social media tweet, the United States is going to stay out of this, and it probably would be healthy if everybody else stayed out of it too. That's probably not what's going to happen, and
Why do you
I
think,
think that's
well, that leads to an interesting question. Why do you agree with Trump on that specific point?
because basically, I think let countries and people sort out their own problems. It gets complicated when a country comes in and has its own interests. And those interests may or may not coincide with the interests of the country you're going into. So, and it's not that I think that the United States should stay out and nobody else. I think they all should stay out. I'd like to see the Russians and the Iranians stay out of this too. Now, what stay out, let's be clear what stay out means. That doesn't mean that you don't engage in various ways. But I don't think that foreign military bases is going to be a healthy development for Syria. And I don't think that uh, external players for pushing this group or that group is necessarily going to be a healthy prospect for Syria. But I think that helping Syria get back on its feet and with reconstruction and all the other kinds of aid, humanitarian aid uh, that Syria is going to need, I think that's something that uh, definitely countries should get involved in and will pay off political dividends.
In terms of Turkey, how do you see them coming out of this? Because I feel like they could be the well, I feel like Erdogan's Turkey could be the big winner in all of this. But I mean that remains to be seen, I should add, but it seems like it could be the sort of kingmaker.
It could. It could. I mean, essentially, if Erdogan gets a relatively conservative, but quote unquote, if you wish, moderate Islamist government in Damascus, that would suit his purpose perfectly well, and indeed would significantly enhance uh, Turkey's influence in the region. Syria would serve Turkey in some ways in terms of level of influence, the way Syria served Iran up until now. I think the real major issue is going to be here the Turkish presence in the north. In addition to that, there have been sound voices within Hay'at Tahrir that have talked about some degree of decentralization in Syria, or theoretically some degree of autonomy for certain groups. And that's something that the Turks are very worried about because of how that would apply to the Kurds.
Can you elaborate
Um,
on that if I have listeners that are unfamiliar?
right. So the Kurds are a ethnic group with large, significant populations in Syria, in Iraq, and in Turkey. In Turkey, they're probably up to 20% of the population. The, the the modern Turkish state was built on the concept of we're all Turks. And it actually didn't, certainly not up until the fall of the Soviet Union, did it really recognize uh, sub ethnic identities. And it's still very cautious with that. The other, I think, thing one needs to know in understanding the Turkish position is what I would call the Sèvres complex, which is basically the Treaty of, I think, 1923. I'm not quite sure, but in and around that, of Sèvres, which the Turks view as an attempt to carve up Turkey, um, and that's a fairly traumatic experience. So there, so the the projection of a Kurdish identity, even if it's not transnational. So, with other words, it's not we are Kurds and we want to carve out an independent state out of the three nation states where we live: Syria, Iraq. There's four nation states: Syria, Iraq, Turkey, Iran. Uh, that Kurdish national identity is so even if they don't want to do that and they say we're Syrian Kurds, we want autonomy, the Turks still see that as a threat to as an existential threat. It's in a sense paranoid. If you look back to Iraq, uh, for the first time in Turkey's modern history, in 1992, 93, whatever it was, um, it got an autonomous Kurdish region on its border. That did not spark demands for cessation among Turkish Kurds. If anything, what you started to get was a process in which the Turkish state, the Erdogan government, were trying to come to negotiate a deal with the Turks. Sorry, with the Kurds. But nevertheless, despite that experience and drawing the conclusions out of that, the Turks have this, sort of Pavlov reflex, if you wish, and are determined to ensure that there is no Kurdish autonomous, um, at least not one that they don't control. On top of which they view the US-backed forces, that the ground troops in the fight against the Islamic State, which are predominantly Kurds, the Turks view them as terrorists, as being an extension of the Kurdish Workers' Party, which was the Turkish Kurdish organization, which for the last 40 plus years was waging a low intensity conflict with Turkey. So I think, in terms of determining what Turkey's relationship is going to be to Syria and how that may or may not serve, how Syria may or may not serve Turkey's purpose is going to be decided on the Kurdish issue.
And the Kurds are mainly the Kurds in Syria are mainly in the northern area, right?
Yeah,
Okay,
right.
I just wanted to clarify that for my listeners.
Yeah,
Is
right.
there anything
And in
else?
fact, part of, if I may, just so Turkey wants to move the Kurds, if you wish, east of the Euphrates, which basically means a significant uh, distance away from the Turkish-Syrian border, and it wants a buffer zone to ensure that the Kurds stay where they move to.
With regards to Turkey, does it have a broader, I don't want to say like an end game, but like I guess what is its greater aspirations in the region?
I think it wants to be a regional leader. It sees itself as, a former empire that dominated the region, which is true for a significant period of time, hundreds of years under the Ottoman Empire. And I don't think that Recep Tayyip Erdogan thinks that he can restore the Ottoman Empire, but I think that he would like to be a modern day Islamic leader, which includes the Middle East. It's not exclusively in the Middle East, but includes the Middle East, and of course would include what he would view as the Turkic world, which is a swath of land that stretches across Central Asia to the Chinese border, or to Xinjiang, in fact, the northwestern Chinese province.
So, I guess, is there anything else you wanted to add about the situation? Well, like, what does this mean for um, the Kurdish population in northern Syria? I don't know if you had anything else to add. I think you covered it pretty well, but
Uh, to quote you, the honest answer is I don't know.
right.
So, with other words, look, um, the Turkish Foreign Minister Hakan Fidan gave a brief press conference in a statement earlier today at the Doha Forum in Doha, in which he said um, he insisted on Syrian territorial integrity, which is good, and he also insisted on inclusivity, in which he mentioned the Kurds. Um, on the other hand, um, Hay'at Tahrir has used similar language and talked about inclusivity. Um, but that's something they, rather than the Turks, are going to have to negotiate with the Syrian Kurds. And it's reasonable to assume that the Syrian Kurds are going to want to have some degree of autonomy.
I have a report from Reuters again, pulled up right now. U.S. will remain in eastern Syria and seek to prevent an Islamic State resurgence, Pentagon says. I mean, what do you have to say about the issue of Islamic State? I mean, could we see a resurgence? Is this another sort of, I don't know, we'll have to wait and see sort of thing?
Well, let me put it let me approach it slightly differently. One of the interesting approaches or things that Hayat Tahrir said in recent days is it's projected itself as a counter as an ally in counterterrorism. Obviously, someone like Giuliani, who's turned his back, at least publicly, on Qaeda and on the Islamic State, is not going to necessarily be positively viewed by the Islamic State. Now, interestingly enough, just as an aside, the Turkmenistan Islamic Front, which is essentially a Chinese Uyghur jihadist group, backed the overthrow of Bashar al-Assad. Um, so we're going to have to see whether the Islamic State really wants to make a statement here, and whether that's the way it would want to make a statement in terms of doing so violently. But fact of the matter is that Jolani seems to have already positioned Hayat Tahrir al-Sham as the organization that would go head to head with the Islamic State on that.
In terms of the historic nature of this, I mean, this is sort of, I think you've described it as a tectonic shift. Can you re-emphasize that for my listeners? Like, what do you think the key takeaways my listeners need to get out of this are?
Well, I think the key takeaways are that it blows apart Iran's forward defense strategy. Forward defense strategy meaning that it relied on a network of non-state actors in addition to Syria as a state. Basically, I'm not going to fight my wars with my people. I'm going to fight my wars with your people. And I'm not going to fight my wars on my border. I'm going to fight my wars on your border. And that was a very smart strategy, certainly for a country that, because of sanctions, doesn't have an air force to talk about, doesn't have a navy to talk about, and therefore has to look at alternative asymmetric forms of defense and of warfare. So for Iran, this means that the two most important pillars of that defense strategy have been either blown out of the water or severely weakened. One is Syria, which obviously is Iran's not going to be a very welcome country in Syria for some time to come. And the other is Hezbollah. Both of those were basically bordered on Israel. And so the threat, the deterrence that the Iranians often invoked was, if you, the US, or you, Israel, attack, for example, my nuclear facilities, then I'm going to rain rockets on you from Syria and from Lebanon. That has disappeared. If one assumes that Russian military bases in Syria are history, then losing those bases is significant. It's its foremost military stronghold and the ways Russia projects itself in the region. Clearly, if you get an end to the war, you get an end to uh, shipments of weapons and money in suitcases from Iran via Syria to Hezbollah. That has an impact on Lebanon. and how the politics of Lebanon will evolve. So, I mean, those are just three what I would say are tectonic shifts if they play out that way.
I see a lot of triumphalism now about the end of the axis of resistance because of Assad's toppling. I I sometimes don't like the way axis of resistance is used as a term, but um, I guess what I want to ask is, I think this is a major blow to Iran and the Islamic Republic of Iran. And I know that Hezbollah has taken major blows, but it seems like Hezbollah has remained somewhat resilient. It's not, completely disappeared from Lebanon. Do you think some people are overstating the case when they act as if this is sort of the death blow to Hezbollah in Iran, or
Look, let me put it this way: it's not a death blow to Iran. Iran's one of the major Middle Eastern nations and will be so, and will continue to be so. It's a severe blow, in my mind, to its strategies and to some of its policies. And I think that is going to have consequences. It opens up opportunity. So you could argue that they need to rethink their strategy. They have a relatively newly elected president who wants sanctions relief and wants to negotiate with the United States. You have a new incoming U.S. president who has delusional views of his negotiation skills, but nonetheless may therefore want to look, even if he's going to return to maximum pressure and all of that, may look for openings to talk to Iran. So the fact that there's this huge hole in Iran's defense strategy, I think is could prove to be a positive factor. Yes, Hezbollah has shown significant resilience. After the blows that is taken, it still is capable of slowing down the Israeli ground invasion, of striking at Israeli towns and cities with rockets, maintaining a degree of command and control, leadership resilience, and so on. Having said all of that, I think there are two things one has to take into account. Those body blows don't just leave you cold, and that's very significant, even if you're able to deal with it. That's one. Two, Hezbollah started this war. I mean, this was a different war from the war with Gaza, where you can argue that Israeli policy and so on and so forth. This was a war where Hezbollah started to support the Palestinians. There are significant segments of the Lebanese population who don't believe that Palestine is their issue, and certainly don't believe that, if you wish, Lebanon can wage a war of luxury at a moment that it's on the brink of financial and economic collapse. So even if Hezbollah has demonstrated resilience, it's got domestic political concerns it needs to take account of. And by the same token, there are probably many in Lebanon who feel Syria is not our battle.
I was just gonna. This sort of maybe ties in, but I see a lot of Monday morning quarterbacking in light of Assad being toppled when it comes to how previous administrations in the U.S. have dealt with Syria, and I think by extension Iran. I see a lot of people saying, uh, you know, this highlights the failures of the Obama years, that it took so long for Assad to fall. What do you make of this sort of analysis?
Look, I think what you let's go back to how this started. Um, you had the 2011 popular revolts in the Middle East that toppled the leaders of Egypt, of Tunisia, um, of Libya, and of Yemen, and sparked protests across other countries, including Syria. And the initial protests were peaceful. The initial protests were not calling for regime change. They were calling for reform. And go back a little further, Bashar al-Assad came to power in 2000, and there was talk of the Damascus Spring. There was a lot of optimism that he was going to liberalize, and ultimately he didn't really. He built a crony capitalist system. So his response to those protests calling for reform was brutal. It was brutal in terms of the violence with which the protesters were met, and it was brutal in the fact that he opened the doors of prisons and let violent Islamists out of prison, and that's how you got a civil war that he then, with Russian and Iranian backing, you saw that with Lavrov, the Russian foreign minister, yesterday in Doha, in which the whole fight against the rebels was framed as a fight against terrorism. So I think there's obviously the whole issue over Obama's red line.
That's exactly what I was
Uh,
referring to.
right. But I think that has more, and there's an equivalent of that, by the way. Go back to the final days of the U.S. intervention, or U.S.-led coalition's intervention to drive Iraqi forces out of Kuwait, and uh, the subsequent encouragement by the United States, certainly by Bush at the time, for a popular revolt against Saddam Hussein. And then suddenly, when the chips were down, drawing back from the commitments or the seeming promises that the U.S. administration had made. That's where I'm saying there's a parallel with Obama's red line. If you use chemical weapons, then we're going to intervene. And I think that's a legitimate, uh, that's a legitimate issue. You lose credibility if you don't live up to do these kind of red lines, or if you give in to whatever threats, tactical nuclear weapons threats by Russia in Ukraine, for example. So I think there's legitimate criticism of that. And what is also true is that Obama's refusal to live up to his red line led to the Russian intervention.
Before closing out, um, I see a lot of people say, like, celebrating this moment, saying Syria is now free, whatever that word may mean. Um, but I feel like Syria is still a very broken, war-torn, fragmented country, and I think is it worth being concerned that things could get much uglier before they get better for Syria?
It's possible. Look, first of all, I think Syria is not a free country overnight. I think your description of a very fractured, very damaged country, if you wish, is absolutely true. And it's going to take time and effort and investment to correct that. And it could get worse. So if you get a civil war between rebel groups, if you get a war between Turkey and Hay'at Tahrir, um, just to name a few, sure, it could get worse. But let's put it this way: there are often cases where your prognosis is by definition it's going to get worse. I don't know that it by definition has to get worse in Syria, but ensuring that it doesn't get worse is a very tough task.
Anything that I've left out that you think is worth mentioning here
No,
in closing,
I think
or?
we've broadly covered it.
Well, I appreciate that. I mean, this is like I said, it's a conversation
Stuff.
worth having, but it's a tough one because there's so many landmines when talking about Syria
Absolutely,
and the Middle East in general.
absolutely. No, Syria is a landmine.
So,
Absolutely. But thank you for having me.
I just wanted to ask real quick. I mentioned that you said there were legitimate criticisms that could have been made of Obama. Do you think the opposite is true though too? Where I mean, do you think there's criticisms to be made of how, um, like I think the person who made the criticism of Obama recently was Bill Kristol. Um, is there a criticism to be made of how uh, the Bill Kristols and sort of Bush era types have wanted to deal with Syria and Iran over the years? I hope that's not
Well,
an
look,
odd question.
okay. Well, okay, let's separate things. First of all, um, you know, you've got the whole issue of the U.S. presence in in Syria, which really is narrowly focused on the Islamic State. So it's the United States saying we don't really care what else happens in Syria. People are getting blown apart. Chemical weapons are being used. Um, there are war crimes, atrocities, but we're not really concerned about all of that. What we're really concerned about are these Islamic State people, and I'm not saying that that's not a legitimate concern, but they're also a product of the Syrian conflict, as they are a product of greater conflicts in the Middle East and failed policies. Uh, and of course, you're sitting in the region which has Syria's oil wealth. That doesn't protect very well as overall. Um, and that's one. And with regard to Iran, um, look, I think the uh, there's there's been sure. I think if you look at Iran, uh, for the larger part of the history of the Iranian Revolution, it's not been about exporting the revolution. It's been about perceptions, and again, the Iranians are partially to blame for that, but nonetheless, it's about a country that really sort of feels that the rest of the world or significant parts of the world want to overthrow its regime and are seeking to encircle it. And certainly the more conservative side of U.S. politics has done nothing to try and give the Iranians some reassurance that they have a stake in a process as such. Um, and then, of course, you have the Israeli influence, and as particularly Netanyahu, but others in Israel wrongly, as they had discovered on October 7 last year, started to believe that the Palestinian issue no longer was the core issue, that was all manageable, and the existential threat was Iran. The Israelis were very good in ensuring that there was um, partisan agreement on that in the United States.
I
And so Iran became this lightning rod, if you wish.
There were just two more things I wanted to hit on upon here real quick. I'm sorry I've kept you an extra few minutes,
Not,
but
no worries.
I'm seeing news from 5 hours ago. Times of Israel writes IDF deploys in Golan Heights buffer zone with Syria girding for post-Assad regime chaos. We didn't talk as much about Israel in this conversation. What do you think is going on with Israel in regards to Syria now, and what do you make of that story about the IDF deployments at the Golan Heights?
We talked about it early on briefly. So, from Israel's perspective, seeing Iran being kicked out of Syria and the Iranian base for its presence in Syria and therefore on Israel's border, seeing that being reversed is obviously something Israel will celebrate. But it's feels very insecure about who's coming um, to office in Damascus. And this goes back to the perception of, who are these guys? To what degree have they, uh, is it true that they have distanced themselves towards jihadism? Are we going to have an active jihadist group trying to take us out on our border? And worse even, are we going to have a group that has access to some form of weapon of mass destruction, potentially chemical weapons, which the regime used uh, in the Civil War, and of which it may still have stockpiles that have or will be in rebel hands. So Israel has some legitimate concerns here. There are some people in Israel, and that may very well that may be part of why the buffer zone, um, who feel that we Israel needs to take out those potential strategic weapons, whether that's chemical weapons, what or whatever else, to ensure that they don't fall into the hands of the rebels. And then, last but not least, and I don't think one should forget that, it's a buffer zone in a territory that is, that the Golan Heights are occupied territory,
Yeah, it
Syrian
was
territory,
annexed. Yeah.
conquered from Syria in 1967, subsequently annexed by Israel, and finally the annexation recognized by Donald Trump in his first term.
Last thing I wanted to touch upon here was, I was trying to word it better earlier, but I guess one of the problems I run into with the Middle East and why I say it's a landmine, and I just want your thoughts on this. I feel like everyone has a narrative they want to tell about the Middle East, and I feel like oftentimes the narratives are very Manichaean. And I don't think the Manichaean stories we hear from different factions about the Middle East actually hold up to reality. I don't think this is I don't think the story of the Middle East as it has unfolded and is unfolding is a story of uh clear good guys versus bad guys. I think it's sort of a just
No, it isn't. It isn't.
yeah.
But I think there's one aspect of all of this to keep in mind. I don't know of any other conflict in the world which has such deep root, aspects of it have such deep roots in communities that are far larger than the region itself and that stretch far beyond the region. So this is not just Arabs and Israelis, somewhere or whatever. Um, this you have all the Christian communities that feel that they have associations with the region, Jewish communities, Muslim communities. You're already talking about half the world population. And I don't know of another conflict that has that. Sure, I mean Ukraine resonates with all kinds of people, but not in that sort of in that way.
I was gonna say
That
even all the turmoil that has happened over the years in the Caucasus, with Armenia, Azerbaijan,
Sure.
even that doesn't have the same resonance, I think,
No,
as the Middle East.
absolutely. I mean, no, it has to do with religious associations, with cultural associations. Um, and so, yeah, you get a lot of different narratives. And a lot of those narratives are driven by either self-serving factors or factors that really have very little to do with the Middle East.
Well, I think we should end on that note, and I think it's an important note to end on because I think people should keep that in mind when they're researching or just
Absolutely.
trying to understand this all.
Absolutely. Well, thank you for having me.
Well, how can my listeners keep up with your work?
If hopefully subscribe at jamesmdorsey.substack.com. And the column is called The Turbulent World with James M. Dorsey.
Well, that does it for this edition of Parallax Views. I hope you enjoyed the conversation with James Dorsey. Check out his Substack, The Turbulent World with James M. Dorsey. And as always, if you can, please consider supporting my show at patreon.com/parallaxviews. One more time, that's patreon.com/parallaxviews. And with that being said, until next time, you've been listening to Parallax Views with Parallax Views to Parallax Views with Parallax Views.
The way out is not simply to say, don't do it, just to prohibit. It's nothing else. If we don't do it, others will be doing it like crazy. So, we have to confront the problem. But no, basically, I know of the great anxieties, problems, new forms of control, but it's also new forms of freedom. This is why I always emphasize that internet and all this new digital stuff, it's a very ambiguous phenomenon, but it's the field of struggle. New forms of enslavement, but at the same time, new incredible forms of freedom. We have to accept the fight with no nostalgia for old, allegedly more authentic communities or whatever. I'm not afraid. I'm not afraid. I'm not afraid. I'm not afraid.